Well, good morning. This is the second talk on world history. And in the first talk, if you remember, I was looking at the issue of the philosophy and the fact that the Bible is a revelation from God. That means it has the character of being true in a way that no other piece of information that we have can be considered true. Now, the evidence, if you remember, for that was that the miracles that were taking place and also fulfilled prophecy. And I looked at, therefore, the accuracy of the Bible as being the third evidence of its being inspired by God. Now, today I'm going to look at the Old Testament accuracy, and particularly around the story of the flood. But before I do that, I just want to kind of reinforce the accuracy of the New Testament. The New Testament is extraordinary as a historical document, because we have so many copies of it from the sort of period at which it was set, certainly within the first 300 to 400 years after it was written, but also because when people have actually gone to investigate the documents themselves, they have very often, to their surprise, found them to be incredibly accurate. Some examples are as follows. Ramsay, an archaeologist of the Victorian period, who had taught in his lessons about the inaccuracies of the Book of Acts and how the Book of Acts was compiled in the 2nd century AD, actually decided to go to Turkey to follow the route that Luke describes for Paul's missionary journeys, just to confirm his suspicions. What he found that totally changed him and actually converted him. He found that Luke was, in fact, an incredibly accurate historian. Likewise, when we come to Frank Morrison, he was a lawyer who didn't believe in Christ and thought that if he applied his lawyer's skills to the gospel accounts, he would quickly find that they were full of contradictions. In fact, he came to the opposite conclusion. He actually then wrote a book, Who Rolled the Stone Away, in which he defended the Christian faith based on his own skills as a lawyer and the texts in front of him. Similarly, Lee Strobel, who was a journalist, came to the scriptures as a atheist stroke agnostic, really to see what the contradictions were and to prove to himself that the Bible was false. When he looked at the crucifixion accounts, he came away with a totally different impression, that in fact the Bible was true. And he himself wrote the book, The Case for Christ. Then another person who similarly came to the Bible with a great deal of skepticism was a man called Warner Wallace. And he was a criminologist who kind of dealt with or specialized in what we call cold cases. Those are cases that have taken place many, many years ago, and all we have left are the eyewitness accounts. And his sort of forensic skill was to be able to take eyewitness accounts and determine who did the crime. Well, he took those skills to the gospel accounts of the trial and crucifixion of Christ and came again, to his own surprise, to the conclusion that there is in fact very good evidence that these were accurate stories retelling the accounts of the crucifixion. And in fact, the issue of the differences between the Gospels is what actually lends them their credibility. It shows that they haven't plagiarized from one another. They actually were genuinely eyewitness accounts. And eyewitness accounts will always be varieties. People don't see the same thing or necessarily note the same things as being important. And sometimes people miss out information, which is then followed up by another eyewitness account, which corroborates that they are both speaking of the same event. So when it comes to the New Testament, we have really good grounds for believing that this is an authentic and accurate account of history. With regard to the Old Testament, the biggest problem, I suppose, is the creation and the issue of the flood, what's called chapter 1 to 11 of Genesis. And it is there that for the last 200 years, there has been great discussion and debate. Now, some Christians are quite happy to go with the idea that the earth was created many millions of years ago and that evolution was the process by which God ordered things. But for other Christians, it seems that the reading of chapters 1 to 11 Genesis require a different approach. And it's that approach I'm going to look at. So when we come to the flood account, it seems very clear that the rocks are the place we want to go to for evidence. If the flood took place, then surely the rocks would tell us if that's the case. And I think there's a lot of initial evidence that that's going to be the case, because what we do find in the rocks is a lot of dead bodies and dead plants, which is what one would expect. And you might say, well, surely that would be the case if these rocks are millions of years old. Not quite, because to be honest, dead material doesn't tend to stay around. You don't, if you go to the bottom of the sea, see lots of dead bones. The thing is, material gets consumed by all sorts of animals, all sorts of bacteria. By and large, creation is very good at consuming itself when it dies, and doesn't tend to leave a lot of fossils around, bones I should say, to be fossilized. So fossils have to be produced by very particular circumstances. And so the evidence of this many fossils, we're talking about billions or trillions of them, does, in a sense, fit the flood very well. So what we're looking at is the top 4 to 10 kilometers of the Earth's surface. Does that speak of a worldwide flood, or does it speak of gradual, slow processes over millions of years? And I'm going to try to bring up a presentation that I've done on this subject and see if I can speak to that. So bear with me as I do that now. I'm hoping that that will be able to do something along these lines. So I see this is going to happen. And this is a presentation I did for, as it were, now hopefully you can see this presentation now. And this is a presentation I did about 2 years ago, in which I sort of state this. It shouldn't be difficult to prove if the flood happened or if it didn't. The evidence should be irrefutable. Because it's a worldwide flood, the evidence should be all over the world. And so I'm going to suggest that the evidence is all over the world, and that there is clear evidence for a worldwide flood. That the rocks tell a story, and it's not of gradual, slow processes, it's of a rapid, 1 year long catastrophic flood. So I'm going to do this over 2 talks. This is one going to concentrate primarily on geology. My next talk will talk about the geography, or the landscape, and how that reflects the flood. So the first piece of evidence, which was known about really in the Victorian times and earlier, was what we call polystrate fossils. And so you'll see here, right up and down here, this is an example of a polystrate fossil. This is a tree trunk that goes through many layers of rock. Now, if you're saying that this took place over millions of years, the laying down of these rocks, then you really are going to have to ask the question, well, how did this happen, that this tree trunk managed to stay around so long? And did you notice that this, to give you a scale, is an ice axe there? So the next example here was examples of polystrate fossils that went through many layers, including rock layers that contained coal. And some of these layers were supposed to be millions of years apart. And so it seemed to be incredible to believe that a tree would go through millions of years of rock layers. You know, trees don't last that long, and certainly not dead trees. Another clear example of why one could argue that the rocks are young was a discovery in 2005 by Mary Schweitzer of soft tissue. And this soft tissue was found in dinosaur bones. And she cut open a dinosaur bone in order to move it, not to find anything. And it's incredibly rare to cut open a dinosaur bone because they're so precious. And when she cut open this fossilized dinosaur bone and did some experiments on it, she discovered that there was elastic material in it, which was obviously blood containing DNA and muscle tissue. None of those things are supposed to last more than a few thousand years. So this definitely indicated that the bones were only thousands of years old. However, it has to be said that the scientific community was not happy with this result. And for about 5 years, Mary Schweitzer had to constantly argue her case that this was not contamination, but actually genuinely belonged to the dinosaur concerned. That was eventually accepted by the scientific community, who then suddenly changed their vision and said, well, isn't it amazing that soft tissue can last millions of years? I think that's slightly unrealistic. I might say that's an understatement. I think that's incredibly unrealistic. I think they were correct. soft tissue does only last thousands of years. It cannot last millions of years. And just to show that this wasn't just a case of finding it in dinosaur bones, this was found in other areas of the biological world. So pigment was found in shells, and then there was found even material belonging to sea slugs that were supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. So right throughout the rock layers, there were examples of soft tissues being found. And there have been over 100 papers now published since then, detailing examples of soft tissue. And I would say that's an incredibly powerful argument for the rocks being young. So I just want to go through that very quickly. Now we come to another argument for the worldwide flood based on the rocks. And this is the fact that we find that rocks are spread all over the place that are of the same character. So the one we're going to look at here is the Coconino sandstone, which when I went on my trip down the Grand Canyon was something found near the top of the Grand Canyon. And the Coconino sandstone is interesting because it covers the whole of the western coast of America, the west side of America. There's Arizona, right up to Montana, Kansas. Now, it's hard to see how that could happen gradually over a long period of time. That sort of rock layer would suggest that it was laid down in one great worldwide catastrophic event. This is not a localized flood. This is a massive flood. Interestingly, the Coconino sandstone was originally thought to be something laid down in dry conditions, and that was one of the arguments used against the worldwide flood. Saying, well, how can you possibly have a dry desert in the middle of a worldwide flood? When properly examined, the Coconino sandstone was found out to be, in fact, a marine sand deposit, not a dry one. I won't go into the details why, but that is interesting, that is. So, another example of a transcontinental rock layer is the Tapete sandstone. And this is found not only in North America, but it's found, and this is the Tapete sandstone, it is found in Jordan and North Africa and Israel. So this goes beyond just being in one continent. This goes over into Africa and into Europe. The Redwall limestone here is interesting as well, because this particular limestone is found in Devon. You see it when you drive down into Devon, the red sort of the red limestone there, and it's also found in the Himalayas. So we're going now right over to Asia, the other side of the world. And this all speaks of rock layers that must have been laid down by one catastrophic event. The other, and I think really interesting piece of information that supports the idea of a worldwide flood is the fact that there are gaps between the rock layers in terms of, if you're going to believe in millions of years, where supposedly nothing happened. But even more incredible is that between those gaps, or in those gaps, is completely flat, straight lines. So there appears to be no erosion. Now, I teach geography, and the one thing I know is that erosion takes place and takes place quite quickly. And so it's that lack of erosion that is amazing. Now, you can see here these straight lines all across the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is amazing because the rocks are different colors. So this lines and these flatness is self-evident as you go down. And you can see here, there's no gaps between these rocks. They are laid one on top of the other, as if they were laid down all at the same time. If you had thousands and millions of years between each of the layers, you would expect some level of erosional disturbance. And that's what we don't see. You can see there. What we in fact see is these flat, straight lines. And I've kind of looked on Google Pictures for rock faces around the world, and wherever there are those straight lines to see, that's what you see. You don't see this. You see this. And this is the product of a catastrophic event that lays them down all at the same time. This was what I'd expect if we were talking about millions of years, gradual processes. Another interesting feature is that where we do see let's say, not straight lines, what we actually see is the folding of rocks, the bending of rocks, probably due to some sort of earth movement. Now, why that's interesting is because this really can only happen if the rocks are wet or soft, a bit like plasticine. Now, if the rocks are dry and hard, then they will not bend like that. They'll crack. Now, you could bend rocks under pressure and heat. That's called metamorphic rocks. But these rocks have not been subjected to pressure or heat. They are what they are. They are just ordinary rocks, and they have been bent. And almost certainly that will have been done just after or during the time of the flood, when the rocks were still soft and, as it were, easy to bend. Now this is topography, and I will deal with that in the next talk. What we see in geology is, in a sense, an opportunity to ask the rocks a question. How did you get formed? And it seems to me pretty clearly that the rocks display the characteristics of, as it were, catastrophic formation, probably, well, certainly all at the same time or over a period of time that might last a year or little more than that. And I suppose the final piece of evidence that would support that contention is the fact that when fossils have been, as it were, tested for carbon-14, it's been discovered that those fossils contain carbon-14. Professor Steve Taylor from Liverpool University has done such experiments and published his paper in 2019 on this. And that clearly shows to us that those rocks are thousands of years old. The same thing has been done for coal and for diamonds, again coming up with results of thousands of years old. Now, I am aware that there are other radiometric tests that are done which suggest the rocks are millions of years old and billions of years old. That I will look at another time, but it looks to me that if you were to take the weight of evidence points towards the worldwide flood as being the most reasonable explanation for this top 4 to 10 kilometers of rocks. Unlike, as it were, the one piece of evidence that I have that points towards an older Earth. In science, one often has to weigh up evidence and ask the question, well, that might be an anomaly. There might be another reason for that result. And I would suggest that the radiometric dating that's being used to show that things are millions of years old, whatever it's measuring, it can't be measuring time. It must be measuring something else. And I think that would be an interesting question in its own right. But I hope that this little talk has shown to you where I see the evidence for a recent worldwide flood. But I do want to kind of emphasize the fact that not all Christians hold to this position. But I think from my perspective, this seems the most reasonable explanation for what we see around us. Thank you for your time.